Hey everybody, this is AOMISHOT22 for PokerCoach.com. Just going to be playing 4 tables of 100 Zoom. Forgive me if I'm not commentating infinite amounts. It's just there's a lot of action going on. I'm actually so it's very important to find like some exploitative folds pre-flop against people that are playing 13-7, people that are just playing tight in general. Like optimal GTO frequencies for folding to 3 bets after you raise pre-flop are roughly 65%, 60 to 65%, depending on the raise sizings and whatnot. And in an environment where people are decently tighter than equilibrium, we actually should be folding almost 70% to 3 bets on average in these games. And also, people are really not sensitive to sizes. If you're UTG and you're getting 3-bet like 5x, you're actually mixing fold with something like jacks. You're also mixing fold with like nines. Like it's not like you always call jacks, but then like you always call jacks and then always fold nines. That's not really how it works. But people are just way too loose to 3 bets on average, and doesn't work out very well. It's a very very high EV card for the in position player. However, kings just get barreled very often, and sort of like duplicating the blockers of the king X. And in addition to that, having the queen of clubs, which is very important to actually have some blockage of the queen of clubs, because we need to be bluffing on club rivers. And yeah, I mean, I could explain a little bit more about how I'm structuring my range in these situations on the rivers as far as like bet sizings and blah blah blah. I won't go too deep into it given that we're playing so many tables, but we're barreling a number of combination draws that are actually queen X of clubs and that sort of thing. And it's very poor chosen sizing for my opponent. Obviously, he just doesn't have a large nut advantage, and it's quite a polarized. Like it's just a bad strategy. We begin to actually start folding some top pairs on the flop, but unfortunately, with the backdoor straight draw, I'll mostly be calling this. However, I do roll a bit high, and I think exploitatively, this bet sizing is generally going to be targeted to sort of make us call a little bit more often than we should. And also, he's raising UTG. When you really understand here, we're actually supposed to be mostly playing our range as a call, and not really having 5 bets in this sequence. I don't think you add much EV to your strategy by like 5 betting aces. I think they're all very, very similar. Exploitatively, you could argue that it does, but whatever. Let's see. I'm mixing eights, calling half the time and folding half the time. We roll 75. That's going to be the more passive option, which is going to be fold. Yeah, obviously we're against a polarized range. We just don't have we don't have races on the flop very clearly. It's kind of like a nuts versus air game, except that we have some of the nuts in our range with aces. Queens is going to be far too loose to get in here, but actually our opponent could be shoving queens. Versus normal people, like versus a reg, I would always fold kings here because regs are just never bluffing and they just don't perceive us to have something like kings or queens. Unfortunately, versus an unknown recreational player, we sort of have to call this, though I think he's having a lot of a lot of aces in his range very, very often, and not as many queens, unfortunately. Just the equity that we have with the king of hearts against his sort of like ace of diamond, ace of spade hands forces us to call this hand. But yeah, we're just not finding enough bluffs in our opponent's range in general. Often what's happening is, like versus a regular, I would just be pitching there. Flop. Yep, mostly just going with the call. Okay. Sorry. And what position are we in? Yeah, we're going to go to the range c-bet. Now, range c-bet is like super exploitable in the sense that our opponent can really increase his EV by like playing a very high frequency check raise because of the fact that our opponent's like calling range out of position there. At least it should be here. The queen jack doesn't really do a whole lot of mixing at equilibrium, especially without a club. The diamond and the spade are even worse because they basically block the most frequent combinations in our opponent's range. Certainly, you could argue that, oh, we should overbluff this because our opponent doesn't have enough good stuff. river, we are going to be bluffing because we end up hitting the 10 so often. I'm going to be using one sizing, and it's going to be a sizing for like a 10, for an 8, for a 7, that sort of stuff. I don't think I need to be splitting my range. A bunch of the flush draws are getting bet on the turn. Given that I really am 3-betting a hell of a lot of ace-x of clubs pre, and that's mostly a function of the fact that I think the environments are probably going to be a little bit call happy pre-flop against 3-bets, and therefore I think structuring your range in a way that, like the big blind 3-betting range is generally quite polarized, but in these sort of environments where people are calling 3-bets too wide, I think you often want to. This is going to mix. We're going to go with the call here, but very, very often calling. We're playing quite a polarized 3-betting strategy. Now, the polarized 3-betting strategy, blind v blind, is actually a little bit different. Here we're going to be mixing bet and check with the Jack 9. We just unblock kings that are betting in his position, and yeah, against a recreational. So traditionally, this hand would always be a call, right? But against a recreational who has like sizing tells, who's probably not reopening river, this is like ridiculously thin, stupidly thin in this situation. I'm gonna have to mix up the ace-4. Yep, between raise and call, obviously no folds. And yeah, I mean, well played by our opponent by actually using a half pot bet with a good hand. This is like stupidly thin. It's just a function of our opponents not having basically river bluffs. Turn, we need to end up finding some check raises. We end up making deuces, and we have some slow played threes. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of trying to put them in a very tough situation. In this situation, yeah. It looks like a huge sizing, but actually it's just going to be one of the optimal sizings that we find. We have way more 3x than him, and we're slow playing about 30 to 35% of our 3x in this situation. And yeah, it's just the highest EV sizing. It forces him to call the most amount of overpairs, and obviously we need to be finding bluffs on the turn. We can't just always be raising our queen 3s that's slow played, and we still need to be continuing to call a bunch of our 3x as well. Turn mixes, so we don't actually get to be raising every single time, but with the actual gutter, we're definitely going to have to raise because we're just lacking in bluffs heavily. And in addition to that, here I'm just going to check range on the flop. I know it doesn't look like, oh, why are you checking range? You have a bunch of hands, but basically he's more concentrated toward the 8s, 9s, and 7s, and as a result of that, I don't think we gain a ton of EV by having continuation bets, so I'm electing to go with this. Turn, I'm going to mix in some raise, but I roll a bit high, so I'm going with the turn call. He's obviously supposed to have a whole bunch of all-ins on this river, and Jack 10 basically mixes. A lot of his bluffs are going to, like, he should be playing check raises on the river. It's a bit sick in the sense that I think he'll end up putting us on something like, I'm actually going to check this back. I don't think he finds enough calls, and I think that like this looks incredibly nitty to check back, but when you really understand the way that people are constructing their range and then their perception of us on the river and all the sort of incentives and their bluff catchers and the fact that it's like a 3 flush turn, meaning that the majority and well played by him to actually have some sort of like merge bets. Well played. At Queen High, we just need to be defending against min. Just hitting a pair is way too valuable, and he often can just have like worse hands. Queen High has a definitely a reasonable amount of EV to show down, more than a big blind in this situation. It's a very clear call. So at equilibrium, the king of spades is incredibly good to be calling because most of our opponents' bluffs contain the king of spades, and then they have to give up on the river. So holding the king of spades means that we unblock more of his bluffs. Unfortunately, against a recreational player, this is not really something that we need to be worrying about. We just need to look at his like VPIP and overall how crazy he is. Even though we don't really have very much of a sample, and the guy's just being kind of silly and not really representing a whole lot of hands, and now he's just randomly going pot. You could argue that the population of recreational players in these games just doesn't take this line as a bluff enough, and we're not perceived to be folding enough and therefore make an exploitative fold. I'm going with the call because I'm just top of my range and I'm playing against a random recreational player that's just going to do silly things, but you could make all sorts of like population exploitative plays or reads and, you know, therefore blah, blah, blah. Even against a rec, he might actually be bluffing something like King X of spades on the river because he doesn't understand blockers and because he's just going to be very entitled to his king X of spades is sort of like nut flush draw, and as a result of his entitlement, he'll just be bluffing more often, and it's not really a function of like, oh, like I need to, like bluff these hands or those hands, and they're not really thinking about the fact that they want to unblock or call folds in that situation. They're just like, oh, well, we sort of have um a fucking hand that we want to win on the river with, and we were hoping to hit our hand. And I believe, was there a gut shot as well, or was it? No, it was like, no, there wasn't a gutter to go along with that. Sorry, I thought it might have been like ace 10x, and then he'd have even more of the Broadway combo draws, but no. Turn clear check. Ace high just has way too much EV to be checking down here, and we're having to bluff catch river sometimes. Though the 8 is not particularly good. I'm just mixing river, rolling 17. I'm going with the call. He just has an incredible amount of bluffs. I believe that combo needs to be checking. He should be like value betting something like queen 9, but blocking the ace highs that have to be calling on the river. I think his hand is check. Essentially, he's blocking the highest frequency calls, and he's also unblocking hands that are in our range that are going to check and that are going to bluff. So he's like unblocking our bluffs. I think it's a pretty inefficient way to play his hand. Turn, we're mixing it up. We roll a bit on the low side. We're going with the turn probe. Obviously, some people will say, oh, you're not polar enough. But actually, if you're just completely polar and you only have the ace of diamonds, which is... Actually, we have a little bit more of a nut advantage, but essentially you just can't be so damn polarized in those situations. It's incredibly easy to exploit, and basically you're not maximizing the EV of your range. If you're only betting incredibly good hands, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Here, I would generally be inclined to barrel off with the spades because we're unblocking a lot of his like call fold hands. Unfortunately, we are playing a recreational player here. We're just going to start increasing the pot geometrically. We're at a massive nut advantage, and yeah, the way to make the most money is use over bets and checks basically. Though you could, and river, we have a touch of showdown against something like king jack, king 10 from a recreational, but generally not much of a thing. But yeah, in this situation, we basically have like quite a large nut advantage, even though the big blind should flat a decent amount of ace king. He won't have aces and kings, and blah blah blah. I think I just bluff catch king queen here, but he's going to be very ace heavy. All in on the river. Ace 9 is going to go with the fold. Yep. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't really dotage to just like floating flops over bluffing clown, like whatever. That was an interesting play. Basically, the spades are very important to bluff catch because we don't block any of the backdoor hearts, clubs, or diamonds. So we just like it's a mandatory bluff catch with the spades. And I don't even really worry about the spades in that situation. I think it's just like just a hand where a recreational player is opening too much ace X on the turn and they're not value betting thin enough on the river, but they have a whole bunch of gut shots that have just missed and then like random broadways and they just like spaz out and bluff. And I think that the majority of what he's repping as far as like his value region would go slightly larger, and then he'd be more inclined to bluff something like half pot. Sorry for me talking so fast, by the way. I'm not on crack and I don't normally speak this way, but I'm just for tabling Zoom, so I'm sort of like forced to talk about a whole bunch of different situations. But generally speaking, when I'm going over like some sort of a sim or whatever I'm doing, everything is incredibly slow and I like to take my time, but it's completely a function of the fact that I'm for tabling Zoom and I really want to try to cover as much as I can in these situations. So yeah, that's the reason why we are speaking so quickly. We as an I. I do have OCD as well, so like I mean maybe that's me just being a little bit of a spaz. The queen jack can mix it up, or it's clearly a mixed strategy, and in turn we're going with the check. This is a pure check. It's actually a fold pre, but then I think my opponent is too nitty. He's playing 17-11, and yep, the EV is much higher to be going with the call against an opponent like this. Deuce of diamonds is kind of irrelevant. In addition to that, I think our opponent is not 3-betting so many hands like king queen. I mean, I'm just going to fold the river. I mean, this is a hand that we should be calling, and I'm exploitatively value betting a little bit thin on the turn as well, so I'm getting here quite weak. However, I kind of sort of just am inclined to believe that my opponent is not finding enough bluffs in this situation when he's just like on the nittier side. That's my general thought process. As far as like developing flop raising ranges, so a solver will always tell you to be like mixing this hand. Against human beings, what you might want to do is you might want to like be raising more nut flush draws and like raise a few less of the weaker flush draws, because really they're not Pio solver bots. I'm not having leads on the turn. It actually can increase the EV of my strategy to have leads, but essentially it's just not going to be a strategic option that I exercise. The reason is because it complicates the game tree, and while actually having a lead on the turn is certainly a higher EV strategy, here we're just mixing the fours between call and fold. I'm calling about 50% of the time, roll a bit high, and actually I'd probably almost always fold against that particular opponent as well. Turn, going with the fold. Obviously, very high EV card first range. His barreling frequency goes up a little bit if we do develop leads, but then if we don't develop leads, he should be barreling pretty infrequently. And as a result of that, especially with the lack of 4x in the cutoff range and the large amount that we end up having in the big blind range, we're just not forced to defend very many hands on the turn. And against opponents who are going to merge, certainly you could elect to have some check raises, but I'd prefer to not be raising the hearts because I think it's a combo. Well, actually, I was going to say that it's a combo that he's probably going to be barreling too often, like betting the turn with too many sort of flush draws, but I'm not sure if that assumption is correct. That might be a bad assumption. Here we have king high. It's just too high to bluff. We can bluff some weaker hands, but essentially we want him to be folding the king high region, and yeah, like king high is very clearly too high in our range to be bluffing against 2x pot. We basically need to play a strategy that makes our opponent indifferent to bluffing in this river, and we end up having a fair amount of checks with stuff like ace high, and we're going to be front dooring a few too many of the 5x and 4x and the other pair, just as a function of our opponent being a recreational player. Here, mixing it up on the turn. But our minimum value is going to be like pocket tens, so I'm not always going to be betting this, but this is a mixed strategy hand. I'm going to be betting this 100% versus this guy. The reason why I opened the MP in here, and here we're just blocking a bunch of call folds. This is obviously a check. The reason why I opened such a loose hand in MP is because we're playing a rec in the big blind, and he's like quite a bad recreational player, so it's important to like mix it up with the recreationals. Turn is just a mixed strategy hand with the 8-7, mostly going on the side of check though. So this is kind of like a very complex river decision because it has a lot to do with like what sort of flush draws he's betting and then like what he does with pocket threes. It's a very, very complex river decision. Like it's incredibly complex, and then it also depends on what he does with like other flushes, and then how he structures his range with like if he ends up having bet 3 bets. Because if he doesn't have bet 3 bets, then we want to have a bunch of all-ins against his sizing, given that we have some slow played houses and stuff and some other goods on the river. Whereas when our opponent, well, yeah, I mean it's just a complex situation on the river, and him blocking a queen is very intelligent for him to be betting the river. Because of the fact that we're not opening. Now, of course, we're really not supposed to be opening a queen anyways on the river, but okay, we're very high EV board for our opponent. On the ace king deuce, so in this particular situation, it's a little bit different than the single raise pot because of the fact that like it's essentially about putting pressure on his range. When we were UTG versus the big blind on the ace king X, when we go for like a very small bet strategy, essentially we're taking away like EV from hands like 8-7, 6-5, blah blah blah. Whereas in the situation and basically if we don't like when we end up going larger though, we really take a hell of a lot of EV away from his like king X, ace X sort of like gutters and blah blah blah, and it definitely increases the EV of our strategy a hell of a lot in that particular situation. Whereas in the previous ace king X, we're actually gaining a lot more EV by, and here we're just mixing it up with the kings. Mixing bet and check. We've continuation bet our entire range on the flop, which is like incredibly dicey to begin with. And our opponent can play a lot of counters. Here our opponent's supposed to have some slow played flushes, and I roll high. This is a mixed strategy hand. It's obviously you could like cry about, oh no, our opponent is checking behind, but no, it's not really. That doesn't really matter. Your turn. We need to check this. Obviously deuces are going to defend the river. That's way too high in his range. Jesus fucking Christ, that is atrocious. That is so fucking bad. You cannot be. King Jack has got so much showdown EV on that river, blind versus blind, like way over bluffing, check down, low board, BVB. I don't want to like say bad things about my opponents, but essentially I think he understands that that's way too high in his range, or at least I would hope so, because it's very clear that it's like absurdly high in his range, and it's like got way too much showdown EV to ever even consider bluffing. Essentially, like when he's developing his bluffs, or he needs to like I should be value betting my hand at some frequency on the river with the threes, but I sort of think that my opponent is going to bluff a little bit too often, especially when people end up front dooring like too many decent hands. Like a pair is clearly worth a value bet on the river, basically any pair, but I think my opponent is not calling enough, and I think he's going to overbluff as sort of like Jack 10, but King Jack is just absolutely beyond absurd. Like it's completely ridiculous, beyond ridiculous. We are blocking. So essentially, we're blocking a bunch of the two pairs here that are supposed to be calling the river, like Jack 10. Now, against a recreational player, you could argue that betting is higher EV. When you look at like equilibrium solutions, essentially, when we're blocking like we could literally be value betting something like Ace 5 here, and it would have a higher EV than value betting something like Ace Jack because we're blocking more of the. Oh, sorry. Actually, what I just said is complete bullshit. I thought the board was slightly different. Excuse me. Okay. Sixes going with the pure check. Mixing it up on the flop, but it's going to be a situation where our opponent is having a pretty high barrel frequency, so you could actually play some call. I roll a bit of a higher number, so we're going with the call, not having leads on the turn. Not. I mean, on the two-tone board as well, you could argue that we should be mostly going with the raise. I'm not sure how competent my opponent is, but I don't really mind either way. I tend to just try to like force my opponents to play like very good strategies, and no matter what happens, I end up making money. That seems to be the way that I approach poker in general, and it's worked out very well for me. You could say, oh, it's a wreck, you need to just be going massive, but it's like, I mean, it's fine. I wouldn't mind going massive. Ace King needs to be mixing fold and 4-bet. I'm just going to go with the fold because our UTG opponent has got a 6 PFR, and therefore the in-position player should be relatively tight against that. So very clearly Ace King's going to be mixing pre, and then, yeah, just not too much of a thing. Turn, we actually end up getting to have some C-bets. This looks like, oh, it's merged, but actually the Ace-9 has more equity than something like Ace-Queen here. It's not like a bluff and it's not a value bet. It's essentially a merge hand. We end up getting called by a bunch of like 10x of hearts, king x of hearts, 8x of hearts, and it just has a hell of a lot of equity. So it's not like, oh, what are we getting called by that's worse or blah blah blah. That's not how poker works. River, our opponent should be bluffing a fair amount of like queen 8. And I just think it's pretty difficult for our opponent to find enough bluffs in this situation. Finding a pitch on the river. And an easy check on the river. So there were a few other points that I wanted to make, but I sort of forgot what I was talking about, or I got jumbled with other stuff. It's just such a high EV board for our opponent. However, recreational players, when they end up checking back in these limp pots, they actually end up stabbing turn with too wide of a range because they, and when I say wide, it's not even necessarily merged, it's just full of shit, essentially. And yeah, against that here with the 5-4, really need to be careful. It's a very high EV spot for our opponent. And we roll very low. We're going to go with the overbet because our opponent is basically not having enough with the check. We roll 7 incredibly low, and we need to find some frequency of bluffs. We're going to be doing this with obviously like Jack X and Kings. He needs to be continuing with some frequency of the forgive me. Big blind is supposed to have check raises, but I kind of don't think he's having enough check raises, and therefore we can end up going a little bit thinner here on the turn with our value range. Yeah. Actually, I just didn't have a time bank. I was going to be jamming my queen jack there for about 10x pot because I have a bunch of sets there. My opponent has none, and in order to like increase the value of your sort of like sets and good stuff there, you really need to be playing a lot of shoves. I just literally timed out, and then I also had this sort of inkling here. Sevens is really supposed to be pitching. I'm pretty inclined to think that my opponent just has way too many flush draws in this situation. Like this is clearly a fold here with sevens. Even a hand with even a hand like ace jack here might perform slightly better than pocket sevens. This is really I really want to make an exploitative call on the turn here. Okay, I'm gonna fold. I think he's just very flush draw heavy. However, yeah. We rolled 95 last time. Now we rolled 27. Just mixing up the turn. We need to find some bluffs. I think that my opponent is like reopening turn too often, so as a result, I'm playing quite a few more check raises with some of my stronger hands. It's at equilibrium, we would definitely be finding a whole bunch of turn bets with pretty good hands, and in addition to that, we'd be when we do check, we're finding a lot of like check calls with good hands. I'm actually going to be exploitatively shifting a lot of hands into the checking node because of the fact that I think my opponent is basically front dooring too many good hands. And yeah, I mean, because of the fact that they are front dooring too many, or sorry, I think they are reopening turn too often. I mean, they are front dooring good hands, but they're reopening turn too often, regardless. The ace king is going to be going with the 4-bet, pure 4-bet. Even this deep with the ace king suited, we're pure 4-betting it. It's very important to get like setups where they have like 9-8 of hearts and we have like ace king of hearts. This is an incredibly important thing, as well as like 4-betting something like ace 5 of hearts. In order for him to have more stuff like king jack of hearts. Like these setups are not like random. They're ways that you might want to structure your range in order to beat your opponents. I was saying something before about like the solver wants to 3-bet here. We need to go a little bit smaller with our 3-bet because our opponent's on a short stack. I was saying like there was a spot where we maybe want to be check raising at equilibrium. Some of the this is a bit weird. This 6s is a bit weird. I'm gonna go with the call. This is nothing to do with balance. This is just purely a function of me playing a fish. My range is completely exploitable. I have nothing other than like bad hands there and hands that are not performing very well with the 3-bet. So essentially, when we get shoved on here, we having the king of hearts is like very bad because we're blocking the most frequent sort of like. Actually, there's so much money in the pot we're going to be calling anyways. But yeah, we are blocking the most frequent like king jack, king 10, king 9 of hearts. So like that's not something that you want to be blocking when you're making these calls. But yeah, I mean there's just not enough money, and this guy's a bit of a spaz. We're pitching this. This looks like a very unconventional. Why are you going pot on the turn? I don't really want to talk about too much exploitative stuff. Yeah, I don't even want to talk about exactly how I'm structuring my range, to be honest, in this situation, because it's actually like how I just play my entire strategy. And it's a little bit dicey if I start going deep into my exact flop strategy in that situation. So I'll just refrain from discussing it. And I'll refrain from discussing why I'm also just raising pot on the turn with king queen without even any sort of like flush draw blockers. Um, yeah, I mean king high where we just have to defend against min with the backdoor straight draw. So it's not really something we can be folding. Flop, pretty high frequency call. Obviously not folding, but we're just continuing this in the raise and the call nodes, but we're not folding. Turn. Oh, I rolled 29 last time. Almost always playing this as a call. So in this situation, I think our opponent is not having enough check raises with something like queens, because queens would just be checking and he wouldn't have tens. In this situation where our opponent doesn't actually have check raises, I think we should actually be playing a fair amount of jams. Yeah, I mean, I think this is how the spot's supposed to work. Basically, we end up having 10-8, and we have even some more strong hands. And yeah, like when our opponent's not having a river check raise in his life, we basically want to get all the money in, and like we just need to find bluffs, and we're bluffing like around 40% of the time as well. So it's going to be very hard for us to actually find enough bluffs in that situation. And the 10-8 is one of his most frequent river slow plays, which is the reason why I'm using the 10. It's the reason why I'm inclined to use the 10 is because the 10-8 is one of the few hands that can actually go with the river check when he has something like 10-8. Yep. So that's the reason why I'm prioritizing having the 10 blocker there. Because when we're bluffing, we want to make sure that we reduce his highest frequency slow play check call rivers. And yeah, when we have the nuts, we don't really give a fuck. Obviously, if he has like too high of a frequency of nuts in his range, then we don't really get to shove because of the fact that obviously he would just only have to be calling nuts and he wouldn't have to call bluff catchers, and then we're not making any money. And then we wouldn't even be able to bluff. A bluff wouldn't be profitable. Not that bluffs are really supposed to be profitable. Our opponent is supposed to be making us indifferent, but then our bluffs would go from being indifferent at 0 to actually just going negative. So that's kind of how that spot works, right? And just wouldn't be a very bright idea. Now, of course, our opponent could unilaterally increase the expectation of his strategy if he did decide to. We're gonna go with the call here. This is pretty dicey with the hearts and with the 8 kicker, but against the third, we need to continue. Against half pot, I'm folding flop with the queen. Turn, the king is a card that's much more frequent in his range. We're almost checking range on the turn. Essentially, we have a bunch of stuff like sixes and sevens that are check raising. We're also checking almost all of our tens as well. Technically, we should be checking about half of our tens, but against people that are reopening the turn, here I'm just folding a queen to the double barrel. Against people that are reopening the turn too often, and against 9, we need to be mixing the fives. I'm mixing about 25% call against this sizing, going with the fold. I am calling about 25% of the time versus that sizing though. So when I'm talking about he can like essentially he himself can change the EV of his strategy if he knows what I'm doing with these shoves. All he has to do is just like bet queens a few more times on the turn because my shove is mostly predicated on the fact that he doesn't slow play quads on the river. He doesn't always bet quads on the turn. Sometimes he plays these hands different. Blah blah blah. Turn's gonna mix it up. Mostly finding a bet, but I roll quite high and I don't want to be way over bluffing. Going with the river check. River with the 4, just going with the check call. Yeah, we need to be calling with the 4. It's just really, really good blockers here. Not having any sort of diamond, not holding a spade, not blocking into missed gutters, blah, blah, blah. Important to call the correct blockers. Guitar guy. I don't really know much about our opponent. Our hand is mostly calling against this sizing, if not always. Made it 6.5. And Yeah, there are quite a few nines in our range, and our range actually narrows quite a bit once we end up check calling. But the big blind should have a few more 9x, given that he's calling 2.5. If I was opening to 3x, the nine situation or the nines aren't like so advantage for him. But I'm also check raising a number of nines as well, so it's bit complicated. Yeah, just going with the 4-bet with this combo. A bit smaller, but we're quite linear BVB. We're going with like even stuff like pocket nines and ace queen here. So versus the big blind, we're just going to be playing small bets here. If it was like button or even cutoff, we can start using some larger bets. Turn mixing it up, I roll a bit high, going with the check back, but just a mixed strategy hand. I know this looks absurd to be folding on the river. Forge is just important to be bluff catching here. This looks absurd to fold on the river. I'm gonna call, but like I think this guy just has like aces or kings and absolute shit ton or tens. But like I still need to call for like that exact reason. It's a half pot. It's a rec bet. Recs don't slow play the turn enough. They tend to bet bigger on the river if they have hands. But we're definitely obviously like way more often than not we're just running into some goodies. Here on the turn, our opponent can actually find some slow plays. However, I'm going to be playing a strategy where I'm geometrically increasing the pot. Even though he will have some check raise deuce six, a lot of those end up getting into the betting range, and when that happens, we're going to be firing some large bets on the turn. He will have slow plays, and you could argue, oh, against the slow plays, blah blah blah. But actually, I think that a lot of people are just not finding enough slow plays on this specific turn, given our perceived range, and as a result, we really want to take away as much EV as possible against his sort of like 7x, 8, 6x, and flush draws. If he played a pure range check on the turn, then I don't think that like this is necessarily the most incentivized strategy. I don't think it's the strongest strategy by any means, and as a result of that, well, yeah, it's just a bit complex, basically. Um, River Ace Jack gets there. This is very thin. Generally doing this with a slightly stronger hand here. 16 going to 18. Going with the turn check. River, when I don't end up probing the turn, I'm just going to be using small bets because I'm going to be going like 2x pot on the turn with a bunch of the stronger aces. Our opponent might be making exploitative calls in some spots, and then exploitative folds in others, but we're very, very, very balanced. I've got these fucking strategies down to a damn science. So, making EV with a lot of our range. Turn, we are blocking a number of the exact ace queens that are going to be bluffing the ace queen of clubs and the ace queen of diamonds, and we're just mixing turn basically. Especially in a node where opponent's not going to be finding enough bluffs on the river, but they might overcall something like tens and jacks. I certainly don't mind it. Turn shove is atrocious. It's clearly a spot where I mean it's just not a play. I don't really understand it. So turn here is basically like I'm just going to be blocking the river even though I have a straight. Essentially, like I don't have that much 9x, and then most of my 9x ends up betting the turn. But I do have some stuff like King Jack that wants to be betting the river that check the turn. So it's the same sort of situation in the other place where we just don't want to be super imbalanced and greedy and go huge with a 9, but then go smaller with other hands. It's just a function of like the range versus range situation and what our range is trying to accomplish. We're mostly just going smaller, and a lot of his 9x end up getting bet on flop and turn as well. So as a result, we can even be value betting as thin as a 10. Yes. Okay, guys, so I'm going to call this, well, we'll sit out next big blind. And then I'll call this a video. These mono boards, I mean, in position has a very slight advantage, but I think most 100 NL guys don't really leverage their nut advantage. Just playing some delays for this sizing here and mixing up the flop. And I'm basically using a sizing that's like designed to, and flop versus the raise, we're going to have to mix, and we're going to have to mix call and fold. We roll low, so we're going with the call. Turn, this is a card that actually increases the EV of our range quite significantly, given that we end up hitting a bunch of straights and tens. As a result, I'm going to end up developing a leading range. Yeah, this card is much higher EV for me. Obviously, like your average poker player is going to be angry and saying, "Oh my god, oh, what if he shoves all in with an overpair?" Blah blah blah. But I'm just playing good strategies. Like no one's going to beat me if I'm playing better strategies than my opponents. That's just how poker works. I don't really go into all the metagame bullshit. I just try to play better than my opponents. So don't worry about it. Just understand ranges in these spots and understand how these situations function. And yeah, and we are going to have to mix a touch of fold on the flop against the 3-bet, especially against opponents who are generally under bluffing. Even if they're under bluffing, though, you can't just fold 100%. That's just not a good approach to poker. Yep. Okay, guys, this is AOMISHOT22. Thank you for watching, and peace out.